Would you like to come in, Craig? What's up, everybody? Welcome to Roundup for, oh gosh, it's the 8th of February in Australia, which probably means it's the 7th of February in the USA and South America. Sorry, I was just reading the chat. Craig was described as our brown king. He is a bear. He is a bear. Anyway, yeah, Roundup is, if this is the first time you're tuning into Roundup, Roundup is a content that we hold, I'll say like every Wednesday night in the US and every Thursday morning in Australia, and then like somewhere in between if you're caught between the USA and Australia, where we just like talk about what's been going on in the broom in the last week. And, in some ways it's kind of like a town hall for the broom. And in some ways we just like get on and sometimes it just goes in whatever direction it wants to go into. Sorry, there's some Craig banter in the chat. But I mean, I feel like what's been kind of coming up for me, which I sort of like glibly labeled as quote wokes, unquote, in the channel, in the pinned messages that we use to kind of keep track of the things that we want to talk about, is, yeah, I think like a few different members of the broom mentioned that in the past week. Like, I want to say like theosophy, as in like big T theosophy, and not like theosophy as like I guess like a love of the study of God has been coming up. And yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious like how that's been coming up for y'all.
Well, we've been having no, I'm just kidding. Yes, thanks for like breaking down to the difference between like the theosophy religion and then theosophy, like what you defined as like the practice of like, what did you call it? Like loving God or like knowing God?
Yeah, I'm gonna look up the etymology of that while we're going.
Okay. Yeah. There was a pretty juicy conversation that unfolded in the Sharia Way Nest channel. Um, However, it wasn't the first time that theosophy came up in the room. Um, I think it was just the first time that there was like a lot of conversation happening around it um, among members of the broom, and it kind of led us into this realm of like conspiracy and the intersection, I guess, of like conspiracy and wokeness. Um, and I wonder what that brings up for anyone in the spiritual sense, or even in the context of the conversation today. Like, yeah.
I guess I'm still, well, first of all, subtle plug for Sharia Way in the broom. Just want to say that. And also, I'm still not entirely clear on the connection between conspiracy theory and wokeness, so I'm kind of curious to see how that will unfold.
I mean, I feel like I'm also like unclear sort of on the connection between conspiracy theories and theosophy, but like as we were kind of talking about a little bit in the preamble, there's sort of like this sense. I feel like people have like vibes about theosophy, and like some of us maybe have like direct experience with teachers who come from like the theosophical school, I want to say. But yeah, I feel like I can talk a little bit. The Theosophical Society, I should say. I feel like I can talk a little bit about like what I see as the connection between conspiracy theory and like wokeness. from a
Please
metaphysical
do.
perspective. But I kind of want to like start off, I guess, by talking about like, yeah, like if people have been talking about synchronicities with regard to like the Theosophical Society coming up in the last week, I'd love to hear like how those have been showing up because I feel like that's something that kind of tends to happen in the room like from time to time on a fairly frequent basis. It's like, I mean, like in the Dreams channel, we kind of discovered that a couple of different people had been dreaming about red hummingbirds and like the same colors and the same animals and shit like that. And then I think when the Theosophical Society came up or theosophy came up, like even like somebody who only just recently joined the broom had said that it's been coming up for them. And I think Hoda, you mentioned it'd been coming up a little bit for you, and it's definitely been coming up for me. So yeah, I guess I'm curious if anybody wants to talk about how it's been coming up before we kind of explore all of these connections, which don't seem like they should be connections.
Um, yeah, I'll say for me, um, it's been coming up and showing up this week. Regarding some of the texts that I have read from like Rudolf Steiner. So like some of the words, like literally the textual pieces of work that I've read from Rudolf Steiner, who's a little bit like adjacent to the Theosophical Society, right? He's coming from like a more like anthroposophical lens. And
Mm.
in particular, I think the text that I was thinking of was in an essay or no, a speech of Rudolf Steiner's that was um, turned into a text and then later transcribed into a YouTube video about Lumeria. And
Mm.
I talk a lot about Moo. I'm like team Moo all the way. And it's such a like I think like an obscure and like niche pocket of like gnosis, and in the sense that there's not a like a lot of material about it, there's not a lot of people talking about it, um but there was also a structural like point that Rudolf Steiner was using in his work to talk about Lemuria, which is like this framework that um human consciousness kind of developed in stages, and that there were different societies and different groups that sort of formed like the bare bones of not only society as we know it today, but almost like the bare bones of like our spiritual, mystical understanding. And these people were like known as like Lumerians or people of Mu. And in his work, which I'll probably share the video later and maybe we can share it in the episode details. I don't know if that would be aligned, but it's really insightful in the sense that he's Rudolf Steiner himself is this person who comes from a theosophical tradition, who pivoted to an anthroposophical tradition that he kind of made on his own, and then later on started
Mm.
to write about like these deep dives about like human history and like earth history, from that like anthroposophical, I'm gonna get this word right, I promise, anthroposophical lens. So yeah, that's been kind of coming up for me. I'm curious.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I guess like the way it's been coming up for me mostly, and I'll say I think like probably around 50% of it's been coming up for me in the sense that like, I feel like, from talking to y'all, some of you have this experience too where like you'll just feel called to like meditate. And some people will be just like, oh, like you're napping, right? I'm like, no, I'm meditating. It's different. But the reason it's different is because I feel like I'm kind of awake the whole time. And yeah, like I think 40-50% of the way it's been coming up for me is like I'll just get nudges which feel like they're theosophy related while I'm meditating. And like in the way I've kind of talked about, like my process of meditation, like very recently, but also for like a very long period of time, I'll say that like when I'm meditating, I'm basically giving over my vessel towards like the harmonization of like a larger vessel, which like often I'll call like the collective vessel of human consciousness. Um, so yeah, like, like I kind of like to think about my body as one body of many bodies, and also like the bodies of my bodies as being part of my body in the same way that my body is part of the bodies that we're part of. Um, so I feel like it kind of makes sense that like things kind of pass through like that, right? Like even I think when like we're completely embodied, um, it's not like we're just like fully pressing our awareness through all of our body evenly at the same time.
Mhm.
And so, like, I think, like, each part of my body would sometimes be like, "Oh, okay, so, like, Nobu's listening to Kali Uchas right now." And then sometimes other parts of my body would be like, "Oh, like, Nobu's, like, eating right now," you know? And I feel like it's been the same with, like, theosophy or the theosophical school. So I feel like, yeah, like, I've been meditating and I've been kinda getting nudges, like, the collective body of human consciousness is listening to the theosophical school or something. Um, but I'd say that like more conceptually or formally, I'd say that like I've just, I moved back to Perth like sort of like over the new year, and I've been kind of tuning into what's been going on spiritually here. And there is like a theosophical society here. So some of the people that I'm connected to have been talking about the things which go on there, as well as like in another school, I'll say, called Gnosis, just Gnosis. And like, what's kind of funny to me about these two institutions is that they both kind of take regular words and then use it as a brand, like I don't know, like for me, a brand name requires like a little bit more than just like taking a regular word. Especially like if it's a very particular word. Like I think it's sort of like a dick move for me to like name a school Nurses as if you own Nurses, or to name a school Theosophy or even the Theosophical Society is a little bit more qualified. But I think when most people use the word Theosophy, they use it with like a big T, and then it's like they just like claimed all of Theosophy or something. And like to further my point, which is already pretty long, I'll say that like at least like in Australia, or at least in Western Australia, you can't just like name something in a way that allows it to take too much real estate in like people's sort of lexical awareness, So you can't just be like, oh, we're like the laser clinic. You have to be like, oh, we are the East Perth Laser Clinic, or we are like the West Perth Laser Clinic, or something like that. But I feel like there's some similarities there between theosophy and like nurses. And then I guess like some of the other nudges I've been getting are towards like I'll say like the fact that like one of my teachers was like pretty involved with like theosophical teachings, and I would say like a lot of his teachings came from that school. Um, Even though he may have like commonly been seen as coming from other lineages, and I'm kind of like I think Hodder knows who I'm talking about. But I'm kind of curious about how I'm walking around that. But yeah, I guess I'm holding space to see if anybody else has anything to say about the nudges they've been getting about the Theosophical School, and maybe like what it pertains to on a collective level.
I'm not sure that I have a answer to your question, but I will say that so Julie dropped the I guess it's the Theosophical Society logo in the chat, and it's a very interesting image, I will say. Um, yeah, and Julie's saying that overall the logo feels disconcerted rather than harmonious,
Hmm.
which kind of aligns for me, I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to say more about what the logo consists?
Yeah, the first thing that I said or that I noticed immediately was so it has the Merkaba, which I know is a Merkaba, but it's also considered the Jewish star, um,
Hmm.
or the Star of David.
Hmm.
Sometimes people know it as the Star of David. And
Hmm.
then atop of it is actually, so I don't know the name of this symbol, but I am pretty certain it's a Hindu symbol.
Hmm.
Um, but a Hindu symbol that the Nazis later inverted and used as their logo.
Hmm.
So seeing these two
Hmm.
things in one image so close together was like, whoa,
Hmm.
that's intense. Even if, uh, you know, it's not the Nazi logo. It's not. But
Hmm.
it
There are
looks
like
pretty.
ties between like the Theosophical Society and like Nazism, right?
What was that?
There are ties between the Theosophical Society and Nazism, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have no clue, but Hoda is saying yes, there are allegations. Yeah,
Mm.
Interesting.
and like, yeah, based on this image, I wouldn't be surprised.
Hmm.
But again,
Yeah.
uh,
Hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure like if I can speak on that to be honest, but hmm. Yeah, well, it says there are allegations. I think there are people also that like we were talking about Rudolf Steiner before, um, who sort of were associated with Rudolf Steiner, who went on to be like, either like neutral to Nazism or yeah, like perhaps involved in the development, perhaps like even in like the occult workings, which I feel like were kind of associated with the rise of Nazism. In ways I don't know if like a lot of people like know about or talk about, like the way that like mythology was sort of blended um to yeah, I'd say metaphysically and in the material kind of yeah, I'll say like build a coalition. um but yeah, I feel like I'm kind of being guided to like not go deeper into that right now and perhaps yeah, maybe talk a little bit more about what I feel is coming up and like why theosophy is sort of like coming up in association with these things. Um, hmm. I mean, I feel like something that's been coming up recently, and I actually didn't get to tune into the Archetypal Hour episode this week, so maybe y'all can like chime in on this, is like the topic of syncretism. Um, and I feel like there is like a way that this overlaps or connects with like appropriation and perennialist philosophies. Um, and also like cosmically speaking, I would say like connects to like remembering indigenous lineages. Um, that feels like pretty auspicious to talk about for me. Um, but I don't know if there was anybody who was in the archetypal hour. Does anybody want to talk about that? Or type about it so I can read stuff out about it? I was saying I was there and I felt like syncretism was very present, especially regarding the story of Isis.
Will y'all remind me what syncretism is, please? I always forget.
I mean, like etymologically, it relates to like the etymon sin, and then like the Crete part comes from like the literal place of like Crete, which is like
Mm-hmm.
um a place which I would say like drew upon like many different like surrounding civilizations. But I'd
Okay.
say overall it kind of refers to um just like bringing together like ideas, teachings, like different cultures.
Right. And like, yeah, bringing it into one thing, kind of.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah,
That's
like
what I thought. But
etymologically, it literally means Crete joining together or
okay.
uniting against the common enemy.
Interesting. Okay.
Hodo saying, especially regarding the story of Isis and how Isis was assimilated in the West as a mother goddess principle and half goddess and family and purification. Yeah, and would you say that like the syncretism which relates to Isis felt like, for want of a better word, halal?
Mm.
Yes. Yeah, that's really interesting to me. Love that you use halal in this context. Um, I guess I'm kind of, jump around a little bit and ask y'all if you feel like the syncretism which is present in theosophy or which is present in the logo for the theosophical school feels halal. Anna's actually thinking about you'd say it does feel halal, like the syncretism feels halal to you.
I was kind of kidding in my pausing.
Do you think it feels halal?
Yes.
Really? I feel like it doesn't to me. It feels like, I mean, kind of like going back, I think, to like maybe what we started talking about before we started recording. For me, yeah, like we were kind of talking about like how Rudolf Stein has come up, and like Rudolf Steiner for me, I have not read deeply into him, but like one thing I've noticed is that like whenever I talk about like the way I see things, people are like, "Oh, have you read Rudolf Steiner?" And I'm like,
Mm,
it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, like if I'm already talking about it, it's got nothing to do with Rudolf Steiner. Why would I go read Rudolf Steiner? It kind of
yeah.
reminds me of like the meme where people are like, "Have you tried yoga?" You
Yeah.
know?
Or like, yeah. Have you listened to like Terrence McKenna or like Alan Watts or
Right.
something? Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think like this way of like trying to combine like sacred symbols of many different schools and then having a logo which says there is no religion higher than truth. Um, yeah, I'll say like again, I'm just going like purely off of vibes. Is like it kind of reminds me of how like at least in my um experience with like Western spirituality or psycho-spirituality, it's like there are like so many different movements where like, mostly like Western philosophers or spiritualists are like trying to like desperately trying, and like I'll say like even like grinding up like different lineages so they can kind of mold them into like a perennial philosophy, which
Mm.
sort of like includes and sort of like abstracts all of the commonalities of like all these different schools or different wisdom lineages into
Mm.
like one commonly like linear hierarchical structure.
Mm.
And then in doing so, abstracts away out all of like the particularities of the land and the cultures and the places which nurtured the particularities of each of these different lineages, so that they can kind of present this like really abstract and flat and maybe like what they might call like a pragmatic view, which of course like in its situating as like an abstract version of like all of these different lineages, I think tends to, even if it's not explicitly done, it tends to like position it as like superior to all of these other lineages, like the
Mm-hmm.
daddy of all these lineages, so to speak. And
Yes.
that's what theosophy feels like to me, and also what like calling your school theosophy and taking up, I'd say, like too much lexical space feels like to me generally.
Mm. I also would like to go on the record and say that I misunderstood halal.
I thought
Why didn't anybody? Come on.
it's funny that I'm using the word halal as well, because like in this context it could be seen as like an act of appropriation, or like
Very cheeky.
taking something out of the context in which it's supposed to be used,
Yeah.
um, and being used by somebody who isn't from like the lineages that kind of use the term. And I'm not sure
Yeah.
if that's like cheeky or if that in itself is halal, but um, I guess like like I kind of, well, in general, I kind of tune into like lineages as like entities, or like as of recently in Why Am I Like This, I was kind of sharing like codes about how to relate to demons using tools which like render them in some kind of emotionality without actually connecting to them as if they're like life forms or beingness that comes from life form.
Mm.
And yeah, like we can talk a little bit more about like syncretism and halal syncretism, but like I'd say like when the lineages feel like they're happy to be syncretized, then that's halal syncretism. And when they don't feel like
Mm.
they're happy to be syncretized, then that's not halal syncretism. And
Mm.
I feel like the syncretism of theosophy is not halal. I don't feel like the lineages feel happy to be syncretized
Wow.
under the umbrella of theosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. It also. Did you just say this, or it just makes me think of how you answer that question, and why am I like this about reaching into other people's akash, which is something that I ask about
Mm,
because it's something that I've heard you and Hoda speak about in the broom, and I was curious about it. So
yeah, I mean, my sense with
yeah.
like the Theosophical Society is like there was some of that going on for sure, but I also feel like a lot of it was just kind of coming across what other lineages have committed to text in the material, which I think is also like a reason why so many lineages just don't do it. Like a lot of
Mm.
lineages rely specifically on like oral transmission,
Mm-hmm.
or even like non-oral direct transmission. And
Right.
when they rely upon oral and direct transmission, they're often like really, really protective of who they talk to or who they even allow to know works in a certain lineage, right? So, like one of the texts that came up, I think Hoda shared it in relation to this topic of syncretism, which it sounds like came up in the archetypal hour. I'm just weaving it together so it feels vaguely the broom related and not just us sounding off. But you know, like was an article by I want to say it's somebody named it's like Amanda Puca, who's like I believe an Italian professor who's working or doing research at like oh she's doing research in a university in Leeds, which is the home of my favorite soccer team. But it was about the revival of what's being called segnatura, which means like signs in Italian. And yeah, there's a white paper, which makes it seem very official. There were some spelling mistakes, but it's fine. Um, but you know, I think like to summarize my reading of it, like segnatura is like a term which has come up, I want to say, in the last like maybe 2 or 3 decades amongst mostly like more like modern practitioners of folk magic in Italy as an attempt to, you could say, like syncretize like folk magical practices from different parts of Italy. So she cites, I think it's Masche I think it's Piedmont, and then I think it's like Magia in Sicily, and yeah, a few different like traditions which have different names in those like very specific localities in Italy. And yeah, I think that from my understanding of the text, like the older practitioners of these different folk religions aren't necessarily calling it Segnatura, but like people who are trying to learn about it are calling it Segnatura. And then in some ways, they're trying to create like a syncretic, I want to say like quote, brand, unquote, so that it's easier for other like newer or modern practitioners of magic in Italy who are interested in picking up on folk traditions to yeah, you could say like rally around like a flag, like something which is more visible, more unified, which signifies a certain thing, even if like that flag doesn't necessarily like use the names of the traditions that it's drawing from. But you know, the author also talks about how in trying to find out information about these traditions, you know, a lot of the practitioners of these traditions would only share with family, or like they would only share with people who are trusted by family. Like she would go to towns and villages in Italy, and like you know, if you were just like asking, like she talks about an interview she had with a man and a woman, and the man started talking about like how there used to be a healer practicing in a certain folk tradition, but then um, you know, like the church kind of came in and accused them of wrongdoing, and so they were made to disappear. And then he started talking about how there was a new healer, and then his wife started like shaking her head, like to give him the sign that he should stop talking about it because it wasn't like, you know, quote, kosher, unquote. And I'm using another word which comes from lineages I'm not connected to in my current vessel, right? It wasn't like, quote, kosher, unquote, to like mention that this person was a practitioner or that there was even a practitioner in the village. Um, and I think she went on to talk about how, yeah, like the way that people tended to find out about practitioners is like, you know, they would talk about the ailments they would have. And then if they were like fortunate enough to meet someone who knew that person who was able to cure these ailments, then they would say that there was a person in this town without mentioning them by name. So like, just to give you an idea of like some of like the secretivity, I want to say, around like some of these practices, and I feel like that kind of like speaks to what you were saying about looking into other people's akashas, but also like just I think like the knowing that some of these lineages have about the sort of like non-halal syncretism of some other lineages and what can happen to some of these teachings when they end up in the hands and in the minds of some of these lineages, you know.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that connects to what Hoda just wrote in the chat, and I was
Mm.
wondering if she wanted to talk about it off mute or if I could read it aloud. I think you said that you might be muted for the second half of this container, though, so let me
Yeah,
know.
Mm.
thanks for offering. And yeah, my landlord just left, so but I also just like want to hold space to see if like there was any conclusion to or like kind of point that you were getting to Nobu about like the red light, green light, I guess you could say, on like who to pass specific like lineage codes to.
Mm.
Because like as soon as you started to say that, my like earth star chakra, like my feet just got like hot. And so I'm like, something's happening. And I wanna hold space for that.
I mean, I kind of feel like it's like an if you know type of thing, right? Or it's like I think people. I mean, like the way I run the 000 lineage space is like if you're in the 000 lineage space, you have like the links to everything, and I kind of trust people to share them based on their discernment. And that doesn't necessarily mean that things will always go well because I fully expect that it might be part of like my path to have to um like gatekeep, to be
Mhm.
honest, like when it comes to 000 stuff, and that might come from someone sharing it, and it might be a lesson for the person who's sharing it to learn that I had to gatekeep 000 stuff because they shared something. And to me, that's just like fine. Like, you know, like with my ancestry, I would say like just taking lumps is sometimes like the only way that you learn certain things. And
Mhm.
you know, I would say like from their perspective, if you're not willing to take some lumps in the spiritual path, there's probably going to be some kind of cap on what you're able to learn. And also, I
Mm.
would say like you're probably like signing up to be inducted into like egregoric lineages because you know like humanity's been like pushing pain onto like all of the other beings on Earth for like a very long time. So to think that we're going to get out of this without experiencing pain seems pretty egregoric to me. Um, but yeah, I think like it's kind of like an if you know type of thing. Like I don't believe like there was like a pattern, let's say with like the Senatura document,
Mhm.
um, around like who was able to know certain things. It was kind of just like, well, this person feels like trustworthy. And there was definitely not like a we're just gonna write everything down so that it's very easy for people to pick up on these
Mm. Mhm.
teachings and then reuse them, put them in their own manual, which
Mhm.
they publish online or something.
Yeah. That's interesting because I feel like that's what was coming up for me because I was watching Dr. Angela Puka's discourse on
Angela, thank you.
yeah, sorry. And I'm pretty sure I muted during that part too. So like, yeah, I could have corrected you sooner. Yeah. Nevertheless, she was speaking to dishonest and honest syncretism, which I think
Mm,
was one of the dualities that she was addressing first, and then later on was speaking to her thesis on Senutore and noticing how I think for me, even as I was reading it, I was like, I was scrying it, like, what did they do to like gatekeep this? Because there's parts of like my ancestry and my lineage that um, really, I would say like rely on the nature of like gatekeeping, and then also um, rely on like this intuitive network or intuitive faculty to be able to differentiate between who is in some cases in my lineages, I'll be honest, it's like who's already part of that lineage, because if they know
mm-hmm,
and you know, y'all both know. And
mm-hmm,
I think from there it's all these sort of like gestural and like behavioral cues that go outside the scope of like um then like outside the scope of like if I was to go like down the street, for example, because there's a Rosicrucian temple in my town, and I can just
Mm,
walk in there and I can sign up. But I also know that there's parts of my lineages where like that's not the case, and it's like that for I think, especially as time goes on, I'm like for good reason. Um,
mhm,
so yeah.
mhm. Yeah, I really vibe with what you're saying about, like you're already in it. Like it kind of relates for me to like, like there's like a sublineage within 000 called like security or like secret.
Mhm.
Which isn't very secretive of me to talk about it, but at certain points, like I've had dreams which feel related to that sublineage, and then I've talked to people who appeared in those dreams, and they're like, "Oh, like, should I be part of this lineage?" I'm like, my sense is like you already are, but I also feel
Mhm.
like that speaks to a perspective that comes from outside of time.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I think that's like maybe like a pretty interesting kind of like ingredient to add to this mix of like, who to gatekeep out and who to gatekeep in when it comes to lineages. Because my sense is like, yeah, like part of that intuitive process is sort of knowing who's already in, or like, on the cosmic timelines, let's say, and
Yeah.
let's say there's like a group of cosmic timelines, they're already in on like all of them. So then they can be
Mhm.
in. Because like
Sure.
they have to be in order to enact those timelines, right? And I feel like that's one of those things which is either going to make sense to you or it's not going to make sense to you.
Totally.
And like
Totally.
maybe it won't make sense to you now, but it might make sense to you later, type of thing, like after like certain veils have been cleared. But
Mhm.
um and maybe it'll make sense to you now and then it won't make sense to you later. Based on necessary veiling which is there so that you can have an experience you need. But yeah, that feels pretty like vibey to me. I'm gonna read out something that Lexi is saying. I don't know much about syncretism personally, but in a cosmic form, I think about aligning with what's authentic through earth and sky ancestry and integrating it for remembrance of some sort. Kind of reminds me of listening to songs from different cultures and authentically dancing to them, like mentioned in that one Sharia Way book club episode. Mm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like what kind of comes to me, and I don't remember exactly what was mentioned in that episode, but it's like, yeah, like when you feel like dancing, you're just doing it. Like there's not really like a reason, right? Like the beat doesn't come on, you're like, okay, like that sounds like a Dre drum, so that's cool. And then like there's a sample from, you know, like a Whitney Houston record, and that's okay right now in the current political climate. So now I'm gonna start dancing, right? Like it's really like something that just sort of happens in your body, kind of makes it happen. Now I'm remembering the conversation. And I feel like that kind of like vibes with what we've been saying, where it's like, like it's not like you can identify forms in the material realm and then apply logical operations to these forms to determine like whether to like gatekeep or not. Um, and have like that outcome be completely aligned with intuition. I feel like this is in line with the saying that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Um, or even just like a general understanding that like what we can perceive and convert into like symbols and then express in like, formally valid arrangements of those symbols can never be like anything but a distortion of reality. Um, but yeah, kind of curious how that lands with y'all. My crown's going off, so I'm just pausing. Oh yeah. I guess I'm kind of curious if there's anything that you could share, like having just said what I said about the insufficiency of symbols and concepts than, formally valid arrangements of symbols and concepts. Like, is there anything that you could share on how Dr. Angela Puka, I'm sorry, um, described like honest and dishonest syncretism?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm gonna go back to the thread too, because um there were like 3 bullet points that she'd mentioned that makes syncretism honest, and then it might not be obvious, but falling outside of um those qualifications, I think would mean that a syncretism is dishonest. Let's see, did I
Mm.
screenshot it?
I'm gonna guess she wasn't talking about lineages feeling happy or not. I don't know if
No,
that would be admissible in an academic context.
read me, okay? Now I'm like, fuck the quality since you said that. I mean, but I forget what Dr. Angela Puka said, because her video is out there, and if people want to watch it, they can. Like, it's literally, I
Mhm.
posted it on the 4th. It's there. But I do want to kind of come back to what you said about happiness, and
Mm.
and then like put that question down, flip it, reverse it to others, and ask y'all, what do you make about like syncretizing or connecting, or let's say like building a network of lineages, or the basis on whether or not that's happening is like halal or haram, for this example, is like happiness. And I guess what would that look like for like lineages to be commingling in a happy way?
Ooh, the broom. No, just kidding.
Cap. No, I'm just kidding.
No, but seriously, from my perspective.
For those who aren't in the broom, could you fill that out for them more on like why?
Yeah, I think because, well, I'm thinking of like the Sharia way, for example, right? Because it's like, well, it's technically, I forget like what the exact description is, but it's like remembering aspects of like these different lineages under one like umbrella, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like, yeah, that's syncretism. And I feel like the work that's being done, um I don't know. I mean, it feels pretty big to me, you know? Like reading the mysticism of, is it happy though?
Like, yeah, because I was, I guess I'm also kind of like riffing off Nobu's question. Like, and maybe it's not in the broom yet. So I wonder if there's like a chance to like zoom out a little bit and kind of imagine what lineages co-creating with one another in a happy way would look and feel like. And if it is the broom, which I actually believe that that's the case for you, and I feel like you're telling the truth, I'm like, yeah, what about it? Like, what's that happiness component?
I mean, happy is like a very interesting word to, I mean, like, yeah, it's just a very interesting feeling, like, for me to tune into, because um I wouldn't necessarily describe it as happy, but I would describe it as fulfilling, which I think is like maybe a um just like a different, more meaningful flavor of happiness to me, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question too, although I don't really know how. Yeah, happiness is a hard frame for me right now as well. I would say like one thing that I wanted to just bring in is from Dr. Angela's sort of piece. She didn't use this word, but the word that I got from it was like a certain level of intellectual honesty. She used the example of like being really honest about what is being syncretized and keeping everything within the spirit of the evolution of that said maybe like deity, for example, or practice. Like she had this example where, she was saying that like these modern, she was using an example of like modern witches doing things differently from the lineage that in the Italian case, differently because of sort of the modern witches relationship with the Catholic Church is different. So their syncretism looks different. And so the example she had was really clear about the fact that, yes, this is different from the tradition and it's different in this way. And this is why we made this evolution. So whether or not the original people are happy about that, that is a really good question and a really interesting one. But I think what she was saying about the honest, dishonest is it was especially dishonest to kind of add to someone's lineage and pretend like you weren't in there messing and changing their history versus be honest about the changes, be honest about what you're doing. Don't try to add your stuff and then pretend like it was there the whole time.
Yeah, I feel like what you're talking to, Adam, there kind of connects to what I was saying about like perennialist philosophies, where they'll just like sort of be like, oh yeah, like this appears in Tibetan Buddhism and it aligns with my abstract of perennial philosophy, and that's all you need to know, you know? Whereas I think like what you said about, say, like taking something from a tradition and then being honest about how it's not necessarily, I'm sorry about the road noise, yeah. How it's not necessarily like the way it was traditionally practiced is really important, right? Because then you're like, I would say like symbolically or like astrally, explicitly branching off. And to me, that kind of like leaves the original tradition separate. Whereas, I think like what tends to happen in like the westernization of like, let's say, I'll just say like East Asian lineages is that they'll like make those changes without necessarily explicitly saying it. So then people come to believe that the Western perspective on a lineage is like the lineage's own perspective. And that, for me, I want to read out something that Julie said in the chat where she said, I feel like for it to be happy would need to be respected as a body and how bodies want to be respected. And like what I'll say is like when people say something that I've said and they don't say it the way I said it and they assert their own perspective on it without differentiating their perspective from my perspective, my body is not happy, right? Like it doesn't feel happy. Like I often feel like someone's pinching me or something like that. And so then when the truck finishes going past, I can continue my plan. I'm so sorry. I feel like then I can sort of like interpret like the experience of a lineage in the same way and project that like if that happens to a lineage, then it's not going to be happy about its perspective being conflated with another perspective which doesn't necessarily align with its perspective, right?
Yeah, that really aligns for me. And I know that you're having like some background noise right now, Nobu. So, um, yeah, that's just really alive for me because I also feel like I was sharing earlier in the chat how like I grew up in like a traditional like Sunni Muslim household and it was kind of like told that syncretism was like haram, but I didn't realize until later on in my life that the type of Islam that like my family practiced was like very very esoteric. And like not only did I like kind of realize that in retrospect, I also realized that like there was this air of like almost like secrecy and like containment that my family, my lineage was attempting to kind of like co-create as far as like environment goes. I think because there was, yeah, it relates to like what Julie said, like this idea that a wisdom tradition is a body of many people's bodies. In other words, it's not just like one body, even though every one body is sacred, it's also like a body of other bodies and not like just an intellectual, like this, this idea that lives in like the abstract kind of world or like this, a lineage to me is not about, yeah, it's not about like this way of life or like trying to live in a certain way. I think for me, this helps me further define like what the terms and conditions are around a lineage, because in the room we play around a lot, like we have a lot of ideas and dreams, for example, about what lineages are. And then like even outside of the broom, there are so many like I was talking to somebody this week about like chaos magician groups, and like how like that could be called a lineage, but also like I would have questions, in other words, for anybody who's like calling those groups a lineage. But nevertheless, I'm really jiving and vibing with these, like, I would say, like, metaphysical parameters that are kind of being set down.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm really glad that the bodies within bodies on bodies kind of like terminology is sort of like entering the chat. Hmm. Sorry, my crown's lighting up again.
Can I read something that you said, Nobu, in the chat that I felt like was important?
Please read me.
He said, "It's not about the broom being a happy place. It's about lineages being happy to me, even if they need to be dismembered first."
Mm. What does that
Yeah.
mean to you?
Well, I guess I think of like um the direction of something, like maybe direction isn't the right word, but like what is like at the center of something.
Hmm.
Um
Like underneath, like craft or something like that.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like a underlying like principle, or just like even like a lens through which something is viewed, I guess. Where
Hmm.
it's like, well, I think about like hmm, yeah, I'm kind of having a hard time explaining it.
Hmm.
But center of gravity, that's great.
Mm.
I love that. Thank you, Adam.
I think like
Yes.
another thing I'm kind of reminded of is like, well, the first thing I would say is like I think often like we've had the experience in the room of like, like we'll be on a call and we'll be talking about something and then like someone will get like disconnected when we're talking about a certain thing. Or like there'll be some like interference in someone's connection while something is being talked about. And I feel like that's kind of like an example to me. And like, people might say I'm like going schizo with this or whatever. But I think it's like an example of like when someone just disconnected. But I think it's an example of like when, like the divine kind of intervenes because like somebody perhaps isn't ready to know something or like isn't ready to know something yet. And then like the other thing that kind of comes up for me is like how I'll say like in the broom in general and like amongst like spiritual practitioners who I have a lot of respect for and in the Sharia way in general, like people are speaking from their own experience, right? And they're not speaking for their lineages as a whole. Or like, like often why am I like this? I'll say from my perspective of my lineage's perspectives, XYZ, right? And I feel like that kind of has that same effect as like when people say, okay, we're practicing like this and it borrows from this tradition, but this tradition did not historically practice like this. It like creates like an astral branching so that the original tradition, you know, quote, like stays clean, unquote, um, and separate or separatable from like the dynamic of syncretism which is occurring in that moment. So, like perhaps like we'll end up, I mean, we already have ended up with like you could say like something that might be called doctrine coming out of the Sharia way, just through like the exegesis of, let's say, like the text of The Mysticism of Sound and Music by Hazrat Inayat Khan. But I feel like we've made it really clear that this is not like what we think Hazrat Inayat Khan meant. Like in some cases, I think very explicitly, like we're diverging from what we believe the opinion of Hazrat Inayat Khan was, to talk about how we are interpreting this through the lens of our experience and our karma, right? And that, when I kind of tune into like whether the bodies of the lineages that we're referencing feel happy or not, I would say like, yeah, because we're not imposing or projecting a perspective into the body of perspective of that lineage. We're not making it easily possible for people to misinterpret our perspective as the perspective of the lineage that we're referencing. And that feels like really important for me as like a halal syncretic code, so to speak. Adam says, I'm glad I'm not the only one that assumes it's for my benefit when audio cuts out. It's like, call me crazy, but yeah. I guess like the other thing it kind of connects to for me is like a general kind of linguistic quirk that I feel moved towards using all the time, which is to say things like, in my opinion, or like I feel like, or from my perspective, or from this perspective, instead of just being like, there is no religion higher than truth, right? Like I would say, in my opinion, there is no religion higher than truth. Which, like is not very common to see on a logo, but maybe it wouldn't be that bad if it did become common for it to appear on someone's logo. Or like just don't say that kind of thing at all, because I wouldn't say that it's true to everybody that there is no religion higher than truth. And I think that when perspectives are articulated in that way, at least in the astral realms, I would say that it imposes upon people's perspectives. But people will probably say I'm like autistic or on the spectrum or something like that. And then I would be like, okay, like it's okay for you to believe that I'm autistic or I'm on the spectrum. But when you say you're autistic or you're on the spectrum, I'm like, please just talk about yourself. You can talk about how your body feels, but don't just state something as if it's factual about my body. Like, just talk about yourself, please. I'll just talk about myself and my perspective. And then, like my experiences, like often when I'm like wading into arguments between people, they're just like stating their perspective as if it's like pseudo objective. And I feel like even when people don't feel things in their body the way that I do, or the way that many people that I work with do, probably many of y'all do, it's like triggering them in some way because it's being put out there in a way which like literally like cramps the space that they can occupy, because there are perspectives in their body which don't feel like they are allowed room by what the other person is saying. But I feel like if those people in the argument were on both sides, or however many sides of the argument there are, if they were to just say like, I feel like there is no religion higher than truth, and the other person would be like, well, I disagree. It's like there's actual like literal room to disagree there, right? Because people are just talking about what's in their bodies without saying things which apply to other people's bodies. And then it gives people in those other bodies the room to talk about what they feel in their bodies without feeling like they have to like push someone out of it. And I feel like in general, when people talk in that way, it is like less inflammatory. Again, even if those people don't feel like they think of like, you know, metaphysical reality in the same way that I'm talking about now, it just isn't an issue, right? Because everybody's just speaking about their own opinion. And I'm not saying like that's going to be like completely able to prevent any kind of like conflagration, but I think it goes a really long way. And I also feel like it's something from my recollection that shows up in doctrines like nonviolent communication. Adam says, you should really avoid this website that they used to call Twitter. No, I mean, like, I talk about this all the time on Twitter, and I feel like overall people are like coming around to seeing alignment in my perspective. The dude from The Big Lebowski also showed up in the chat. I mean, like when I first started thinking about things in this way, I'll admit that I thought like I was being overly sensitive and kind of crackpot. But like I feel like the more and more I see this happening, and the more I pick up on like, you know, doctrines like nonviolent communication, or there's like a book which is practically a pamphlet, which is named Verbal Judo. Like they talk about these things too. And you know, in the case of Verbal Judo, which is like one of like my favorite texts, not perfect, but one of my favorite. It was like written by, I want to say, like an English literature professor who witnessed like a de-escalation which took place between like a police officer and somebody who was like in a pretty like dysregulated state, you know, and he saw this police officer like gracefully de-escalate the situation. Was like, oh wow, like I teach English but I actually know very little about the ins and outs of using language appropriately in situations where there are like high material stakes. So like then he kind of like quit, and he decided to like do a lot of ride-alongs with a lot of different police officers who were getting called into like, you know, highly contentious and martial and conflicting scenes. And he sort of studied like the tactics they used, and then he developed what he calls verbal judo, and then he ended up training a lot of police officers in this doctrine, and I found it very useful too. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'll be really curious to see how the way that we talk shifts as we kind of move. I want to say, like, to use a term that I've seen you use, Adam, like as we move more deeply collectively into like the quantum age, or you know, we spend more and more of our time talking online in places where I'll say that like it's very unlikely that we have like a lot of sharing of context, because I feel like those are contexts where explicitly stating like the locality of where our perspective is coming from has a lot of power to prevent escalation of hostilities, and also a lot of power to de-escalate hostility.
Yeah, I feel
I
like.
also go on.
Oh, I was just gonna
I was
say what
gonna
I.
read out something you said. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember like when I first started like becoming active in the broom, and I was talking to you, Nobu. I remember you bringing this to my attention, like this way of speaking. And at first, I was so pissed off because I was like, no, like, you don't understand, because like I've spoken like this my entire life and nobody listens. And so
Mm-hmm.
I found that like there was a brief period of time online where I like just started speaking very declaratively, like very objectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, wow, this like people are actually listening to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe for like, you know, it felt like this is dramatic, but it felt like for the first time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then I kind
Mm-hmm.
of like had to weigh those like polarities in my field, So I was like, well, like I do have this desire to be heard, but it's like, do I want to do that at the expense of like other people's other people expressing their subjectivity?
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like I also have that experience in school where people are like, "Oh yeah, like you shouldn't qualify your perspective," and it kind of feels like an arms race type of thing to me, where it's like, well, if other people are not qualifying their perspective, then you also can't qualify your perspective. But then, like, like my experience has been that like people hear me, but then it's because like the stuff I'm saying kind of gets stuck in their fields. And then like in the long run that ends up like not necessarily being like what I would call like cosmic or yeah, like you were saying, like allowing for like true interpersonal communication. Like it's more like I've just like won a battle or something. But then, like I've often experienced in my relationships, like further down the line, people will be like, "Oh, well, like I didn't really mean that. I just said it because, um, I felt like I needed to keep the peace, or I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to be argumentative." And I'm just like, well, like maybe if like we'd been able to disagree back then we wouldn't have ended up with this big eruption now. I feel like that kind of same dynamic plays out on a collective level where it's like, like people express themselves really forcefully and then people don't feel like there's room to disagree. And then we end up with like highly polarized, what people call like culture wars. Um, and I feel like this kind of connects to like why I named this topic like woke, where it's like, like I think right now, like what most people would refer to the culture war is like, they had some people saying like, okay, this has been my experience that, I feel like there is like unconscious bias towards certain people based on their identity or how they identify by other people. And then it kind of got like really heated where people started just like stating these things as fact and then stating as fact like what was okay and what was not okay. And then you have all these people who don't feel like they can talk about their opinions because they don't necessarily have the skill or the capacity to remain skillful in describing their own opinions. And people don't necessarily make it, let's like say, like socially safe for them to state their opinions. And so, like, all these people end up like building resentment against people that may have at one point identified as woke, and then forming their own enclaves where they speak without qualifying their perspective and, like, without feeling like they're going to be criticized by people who may have one day at one point identified as woke or been identified as woke. And then you just end up with like two separate groups who can't talk to one another at some point, right? And like you end up with people who, say that you should never talk about politics, or you end up with people like not visiting their grandparents because they don't want to get into an argument about politics or something like that. And it just feels like highly rupturous to me and highly preventable. And I guess the way I feel like it connects to like conspiracy theories is because I feel like the same kind of dynamic applies, right? Where it's like you have these people who fall out of a trustful relationship with what they deem to see as like they deem as like mainstream consensus reality. And then they become very susceptible to theories which maybe explain some of their experience. But then because they can't talk about like their experience or their theories, they end up again like forming enclaves of people who believe a certain thing or don't believe like what the mainstream media is saying. And then because they can't talk about like their experience also, it's very easy for people to ridicule them. And then you just end up with like these same kinds of fissures in society and like what I would call eventually like a non-functioning democracy or a non-functioning society. And it says a gorge. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that all feels very accurate from my perspective, especially
Hmm.
like those social conditions, like being just really fertile ground for
Hmm.
conspiracy theories.
And then, like, I guess as I'm feeling into what you were saying about like being heard, I guess like the dynamic by which I've seen sort of people maybe like being able to see like the value in qualifying one's perspective for the locality of the body it comes from by saying things like in my opinion or in my experience is that I think like eventually people just want to be able to say what they're feeling, and they find that it's like safe to say those things around people who comport themselves with that level of skill and capacity. And then I think like other people see conversations between people who have the skill and capacity to have disagreements, where the positions that people disagree from are explicitly named in the way that people are articulating themselves. And they're like, oh, like that seems like a peaceful place, or like it seems like a place which is not necessarily peaceful, but feels a bit more like it has the energy of a food fight than a nuclear standoff. And I think people are kind of attracted to that, and they eventually sort of pick up on those, like, yeah, I'll say like skills of disagreement. And I feel like maybe that's like one dynamic by which, like instead of everybody having to like state their perspective pseudo objectively, you end up, like instead of people feeling like forced to state their perspective pseudo objectively, um, because like otherwise they're not heard at all, you have like more and more people sort of willingly, I want to say, de-escalating in how much space they take up in the astral realms when they assert their perspective. And I think eventually those people find people who are able to hear them, even if they're qualifying, or maybe even because they're qualifying their perspective. Because I think like a lot of the time, again, like what happens for me when people state their perspective pseudo objectively is like either it gets stuck in someone's field and they agree because their perspective has been oppressed, or they get triggered. And so, like, when they're triggered, dysregulated beyond the point where they can actually engage with what you're saying. Versus, like, I think when people are qualifying their perspective for the locality of where it came from, either people don't engage at all, or they actually are able to integrate what people are saying and then find like where they disagree and then state how they disagree from their perspective, and then the other person's able to integrate what they're saying. And I think like overall it kind of leads to like a more, I'll say, like pluralistic forest of opinions or perspectives, in my experience. Jose says, yeah, to me, I feel like I've developed a taste for qualifying my own perspective. And says, yes, that room to integrate. Jose also says, shall we bring back please disagree? I've been thinking about that, honestly, especially in relation to some of the topics that come up in the room that we've sort of talked about, maybe carving out specific space for rather than tackling them in roundup. But I feel like we can chop that up in the room itself. I'm also thinking about something I channeled in like, I want to say like T167 about integrating what we've been calling, what I've been calling, some of us have been calling red avian codes around like, yeah, I'd say like lexically engaging in battle in ways that seem halal. I'm kind of like meditating on the original topic around theosophy and how it, I want to say, like, held space for a conversation about conspiracy theories and social division to arise. And I'm sort of scrying like how we've covered that terrain in this container. I feel like it's been like a very interesting journey, but I'm feeling pretty complete. How are you all feeling? Halal, not to be confused with haram.
Yeah, I definitely feel complete.
Cool.
Noted.
Well, thanks y'all for being part of this container. I'm also pretty happy that it seems like we're getting to a place with regard to please disagree and so-called special topics or enduring topics that show up in the broom. I'm gonna let Craig the Brown King leave, and thank you for tuning in. If you want to be part of these conversations or like future discussions that we might call Please Disagree in the Broom, then you can find information on how to join. You can also find information on how to support the people who are holding space for these discussions. And
One more thing.
yeah.
If you listen to this and you got something out of it, tag the Broom Radio on socials, please, and let us know.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Thank you so much. Peace.
Thank you.